always delighted to have a return guest, and that return guest is a special delight today. I'm talking with, I'm going to use the word legendary. Is that okay? Or well known, or well established, or I don't
As long as it doesn't imply that I'm dead, yes.
know. You are very much living and creating, and I'm enjoying the things that you're doing. And glad to be talking with Dan Jurgens on this episode. Dan, thank you for being willing to come back and talk with me for a
Thank
few
you.
minutes.
Thank you. It's always nice to be here.
Thank you so much. Well, you have a series that's ongoing right now. I read the first issue of in the last month, and we had a previous chat that sort of was more of a career overview. But I thought it would be interesting to talk about this series, The Batman First Night. I'm always interested in fresh takes on this character who I love, probably the first comics character that I really connected with. And so, with that in mind, curious about how you connected with the character initially.
Well, so I think like many things in life, it's a bit of a, multi-level process. And my first exposure to this version of Batman was when I was a kid. I was probably like 11 or 12 years old. And I saw a reprint of Detective Comics 27, Batman's first appearance.
Hmm.
And I just found it fascinating, even as a young kid, because here was a Batman who looked very, very different. He had the short gloves and the cape felt very different. The mask felt different. And more importantly, the story felt very different. I mean,
Hmm.
Batman goes through the story. It's only like eight, maybe 10 pages long. Batman punches out the bad guy and knocks him into a vat of acid, which kills him. So there was kind of a vengeful Batman who was there. And I'm not saying he intended to kill him, but it could have, you could take it either way.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but I was just fascinated by that appearance and Batman in that original sort of guise and everything. And I just, like I said, I found that fascinating. So then I'd see as I grew older, I'd see other reprints, and that's something that became much more frequent where we could all of a sudden read Batman's entire history
Hmm.
would eventually get repeated that way and get much more exposure to it. And then a few years ago, I was doing a project called Generations. And in that story, we decided to include, first version, that's how we referred to him at the time, Batman. And again, I was just looking at those stories that first came out in 1939 and 40, where Batman felt so different to me. And especially now, because the Batman we have in the DC universe is like this genius level inventor who travels in space and everything else. And I just like this Batman, the original Batman, who was working alone. There was
Hmm.
no Batcave, really no Batmobile. He was entirely on his own, no technology, anything like that. And as I thought about it more and more and thought about that world of 1939, I said, yeah, I want to sink my teeth into this and play around with it and explore that era as well as that version of the character.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you've gotten to spend time with Batman in a variety of ways. You worked on Batman Beyond for quite some time for a good run there, and so really interesting to see this take. The art in the series is unique and interesting, and of course with DC now having the Black Label. You get to maybe push the story in some different ways that don't necessarily get to be seen that often. Have there been particular moments of inspiration along the way, particular elements of the story that you've drawn from some of the source material or other places?
Um, so before we get to that, let's jump back a little bit because I
Sure,
do want to
sure.
talk about the art. And
Hmm. Hmm.
the artist is Mike Perkins, who is a longtime friend of mine. And I think he is doing the best work of his career on this
Hmm.
book. It is fantastic to look at. Every time a page comes in, I just go, wow, this is gorgeous stuff. And I think um, Mike did what we both have to do in a series of this nature, which is totally immerse ourselves in trying to sell those times, that time of 1939.
Hmm.
From a
Hmm.
writing standpoint, it is what is the world like? How do people speak? What is happening at that moment? From an artist standpoint, it's much the same, but you have to visualize it rather than find a way to deal with it in terms of just words. And Mike's work on this has been, absolutely brilliant. Um, what was the second part of your question? I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. I
Oh,
was just asking about sort of the way you could tell a different sort of story and maybe some of the elements that have been inspirations as you've worked on
right.
it.
Yes. Thank you, Jason. So
Mm-hmm.
in going back and looking at 1939, and this is one of the things that attracted me to that particular era anyway, it is a fascinating time, I think, in world history and obviously American history by extension. The Great Depression started in late 1929.
Mm-hmm.
By just a year or two later, had sunk its teeth deep into the entire world, and again, America as well. And in 1939, that depression was still very much in effect. It was a very different America than what we have now. I would say not as prosperous as it is now. And when it was also you know, on the verge of World War II. It would be a couple of years yet before America would get drawn into it, but it was just about to break out in Europe. Hitler was there. The Nazis were already making a lot of moves that went beyond any notion of saber rattling. We also had, I think, the persecution of the Jews in Europe and racism throughout that just made it feel like a time that somehow dovetails with where we're at now in a lot of ways. There
Mm-hmm.
are the overtones of fascism that were playing throughout Europe. There were great political divides here, as there was essentially an American Nazi party, an American Communist Party. There was, because of the economic desperation, people were floating a lot of very different solutions, some of them quite radical. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and yet, against that backdrop, this is where we started to see superheroes emerge. I think the reason is obvious. I think it was for these young men, which they were at the time. I've said this about Siegel and Schuster. This dream of only if only we had someone like this, they could fix our problems, right? They could fix society.
Mm-hmm.
And Batman, even though he was a creature of the night, I think is very much a product of that environment. So I wanted to play around with that. And this notion of, again, such a solitary character who would be out doing these things in this outrageous costume and the look that it would have to have. That's what really intrigued us. So,
Mm-hmm.
in looking back at that material, what we did want to also replicate a little bit was sort of the feeling of those early stories. There's a crudity to them, a simplicity to them in a way, and it's not to say that I wanted to be simple, but there was a directness in the story that I
Mm-hmm.
appreciated back then. And then, even in terms of being a black label book, yes, the nice thing is we can push this a little farther. We can use language and situational things that we might not have been able to use otherwise. And I think when we uh, consider those hard-boiled times, and that's what a lot of people call them, the hard-boiled times, the Mickey Spillane era, that kind of thing, the
Mm-hmm.
gangster era. There's something about that again that just I think mixes very well with Batman. So it's
Yeah.
fun to combine all of those elements and tell the story.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely that noir sensibility and some really visceral street level kind of things that happen. But then I also appreciate the way you've infused it with history, and you mentioned Mike Perkins bringing that together visually as well. So
Yeah.
it's yeah.
Yep. When that had to be it. I mean, right from the start, when Mike and I started talking, I think I said something like, well, this is going to be a book with a lot of hats because everyone was wearing a hat back in those days. And the idea of, um, well, let me phrase it this way. there are a lot of artists who they'll come to me and they'll show me a portfolio at a convention, and I'll see main characters and nothing in terms of the backgrounds, right? It's just like good looking hero, but nothing behind them. And they'll say, yeah, I know I should work on backgrounds. And I'll say, no, not backgrounds. It's the environment. Your
Hmm.
characters are inherent in inhabiting an environment that is part of the storytelling.
Hmm.
And obviously, when I first started, bouncing some of these ideas off Mike, it was this world has to feel real. This environment really has to feel real to this Batman. Like they are merged together because these backgrounds that Mike is doing such a wonderful job on, where we see a 1930s style skyline or building, that helps to communicate the story. That is what we are about with this book. So again, his work on it is absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I imagine it's also rewarding to work. You mentioned you'd been a friend for some time with him, so I imagine that's also a beautiful part of the collaboration that can come together.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I know that the book has 3 issues that are part
Mhm.
of the arc, and so long as you're okay with it, I will have the issue covers sort of popping up in this lovely space right here between us,
Sure.
which just exists there. Curious about anything that you'd like to say that readers can expect, because I know we have issue 2 coming a little bit later this month, followed by issue 3, as well as anything you'd like to mention as far as upcoming projects or work. I know you have a Superman project that's on the way as well. That's at least out on Amazon and been announced in that way. But any other sort of future endeavors you'd like to tip a hat to?
Okay, yeah,
Sure,
I
sure.
think Batman First Night #2 is out next week,
Hmm.
I believe. And obviously, in our first issue, we did a lot to introduce the main players. We, get to see Commissioner Gordon, but more importantly, in a way, we find out that there is no Alfred. This is really Bruce Wayne alone doing these things, and a Wayne who is kind of so occupied with this idea of being a Batman, of helping out Gotham City, which is a crime and corruption-ridden city, to help it to a better place, that he can't even clean up his mansion. I mean, it's a mess, and he's got a Van Gogh hanging on the wall that is crooked, stuff like that. And um, we also introduce a young woman by the name of Julie Madison in this story. Julie Madison did show up very early in these issues of Detective and was referred to as Bruce's fiance. It was almost like a throwaway line, but it was definitely there. And so this is something we're also going to be playing with throughout this series. What is the nature of their relationship? Is Bruce someone who really can get close to having a partner? Is there room in his life for that? Is he too it's kind of a little too easy to say broken, but as a person, he is certainly a damaged person
Hmm.
because of what happened to him as a child when his parents were gunned down in front of him. And so their relationship is key to this, as is Batman's ability to function effectively. We saw him take quite a beating in the first issue. We saw him um, not know really how to handle this whole idea of fighting these monsters. They're different than just fighting men. And of course, in the first issue, he starts to get the hint that, maybe it'd be good for you to carry a gun, just like the police do. And is that who Batman is? Is he an instrument of vengeance like that? Does he worry about what the public would think if that ends up being a part of all this? So all of these things build more and more through
Hmm.
the second issue, as we also continue to play with the world and what it was like at that time, and especially what was happening in America at that time. It had only been a couple months prior when the American Nazi Party had a massive rally at Madison Square Garden. Um, in our own world, of course. And so we refer to that here, though we do say it happened in Gotham City, comic book license,
Hmm.
but that's also a strong part of Gotham City. What was racism like in Gotham City at that time? How did Gothamites view one another? We started to get exposed to shanty towns and things like that. Again, that were common during the Great Depression. Um, and also something that as we see tent cities pop up in a number of urban environments, we're not so far away from again.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And really interesting sort of interplay. And I won't give anything away, of course, but great cliffhanger for the first issue as well. Really interesting story structure there. Um, Anything that you'd like to mention as far as works that are on the horizon?
We just started on a new project, another project for DC Comics here, pretty much yesterday. That's too early to announce, but it won't take too long before that is known. I'm sorry to have to be mysterious, but
Oh, it's
that's
always
the way
exciting.
things sometimes work. Yep. There are going to be a couple of things coming out on Amazon. One is a trade paperback that should be out now that reprints um, the story we recently did in Action Comics. Lee Weeks was the artist on that. And these were the backup features that, once again, starred a young Jonathan Kent.
Mhm.
And also, I think they just announced the Superman Omnibus will be out, covering the Triangle years. And by that, I mean my earliest stuff on Superman that goes back to like 1987 or 88. I'm not exactly sure where they're starting the book, but that will start to collect a lot of what we did during that time. So, yeah, definitely a lot going on these days.
Yeah, yeah. Now I know you'll be at Heroes Con this year. I saw that
Yes, I will.
announced. Yeah.
Yep. And
Um,
also, I believe that's in June, and that's in Charlotte. I will also be at the Baltimore Comic Con in September,
mhm.
in Baltimore, of course. So, and it's been, I haven't been to Charlotte in a long, long time. I'm looking forward to that. And it's been a few years since I was in Baltimore. So I try and get around to make sure I hit every place every few years, give everyone a chance to get their signatures and have a conversation.
Yeah, yeah. Wonderful. Well, the work certainly continues and lives on. And Dan, glad to have you back anytime to talk about projects. And I'm looking forward to the next issue of Batman First Night as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Jason.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mhm.